Okay, so have you ever heard the story about the Pope who was, well, a woman?
Sounds like something you'd read in like a conspiracy thriller or something.
It does, right? But this legend, it's been around for centuries.
Way before Dan Brown.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's all about this mysterious Pope Joan, a woman who disguised herself as a man and supposedly, get this, rose through the ranks of the Catholic Church all the way to the papacy.
Pretty wild.
Wild's an understatement.
Yeah.
But here's where it gets even weirder. The first written account of this story doesn't show up until 1255.
Which is, like, way late, considering she supposedly lived centuries earlier.
Right, so how does a story with, let's be honest, pretty shaky evidence capture people's imaginations for so long? Well, that's exactly what we're going to explore in this deep dive today.
We're going to uncover how this story of Pope Joan, this supposed female pope, became this huge pawn in all these religious and political power struggles.
It even popped up in tarot cards.
Oh, absolutely. And our journey, it all starts with this Dominican monk named Jean de Mailly.
He wrote a chronicle back in 1255. That's one of the earliest written accounts of the Pope Joan story. Right?
Yep, that's the one.
And wasn't he known for, well, not exactly being a stickler for facts?
That's one way to put it. He kind of just threw in the Pope Joan story with a bunch of other tales. Some of them, well, let's just say they required a lot of faith to believe. And even he, the guy writing it down, had his doubts about the Pope Joan story.
So why even include it then?
Good question. You gotta understand how the Dominicans approached history back then. It wasn't really about being accurate. It was more like, get it all down, we'll sort it out later. They were more about quantity over quality.
So they figured any rumor, any legend, no matter how crazy, could become important later on.
Precisely. It was like they were terrified of missing some crucial piece of information, even if it was total nonsense.
I guess in those days, with all the worries about heresy and the church trying to hold on to power, you can kind of see why they were so obsessed with collecting every little scrap of information.
Oh, absolutely. It was a time of huge anxiety. And imagine, in that climate, a story about a female pope. And talk about sensitive. Even if it was just a rumor, it challenged the entire structure of the church's power.
It's like saying, hey, guess what? The church can make mistakes.
Exactly. Throws that whole idea of papal infallibility right out the window.
Now let's jump ahead to the late 1200s. There was a lot of dissatisfaction brewing with Pope Innocent IV, right?
Lots of grumbling. And guess what becomes a handy way to critique the Pope?
The Pope Joan story.
Bingo. It's like the sneaky whisper campaign starts spreading. People are using this story to take little jabs at the Pope and the church's authority.
And how does that play out in the different versions of the Pope Joan story that start popping up?
Well, you've got some writers like Martin of Opava who paint her in a pretty good light. Smart, well-respected, but ultimately, can't be Pope because, well, she's a woman.
So a kind of tragic figure in his version.
You could say that. But then you have someone like Etienne de Bourbon who tells a completely different story. He makes Joan out to be this power-hungry schemer, like she's in cahoots with the devil.
Wow. From tragic heroine to, like, a villain.
And here's the crazy part. Both versions, even though they're so different, end up supporting the church's view on women and power.
So basically, women, great, but stay away from the papacy.
Exactly. It just goes to show how one story can be twisted and turned to fit all these different agendas. It becomes a tool to control how people think, to keep the power structure nice and tidy.
Okay, so we have this explosive story making the rounds. But then things take a truly unexpected turn. Pope Joan's bust pops up in the Siena Duomo, right there, with all the other popes.
It's wild. It's like the church itself was saying, yeah, she was real. Can you imagine this possibly female pope immortalized in one of Italy's grandest cathedrals?
You'd think they would have double-checked their facts before adding her to that lineup.
Maybe the story was so widely accepted by then that it wasn't seen as a big deal, just a quirky historical footnote.
But that acceptance was short-lived. In 1600, during the Counter-Reformation, bam, they yank her bust right out of the Duomo.
No more quirky footnote. Now she's a threat.
So what changed? Why the sudden 180?
Well, remember those reformers we mentioned? Guys like Martin Luther and John Calvin? They were really turning up the heat on the Catholic Church. And you know what became a handy weapon for them?
Don't tell me. The Pope Joan story.
Yep. They used her to bash the Catholic Church, saying her presence messed up the whole line of popes, like she invalidated the entire system.
So the reformers are using this Pope Joan story to really hammer the Catholic Church.
Oh yeah, it's getting heated.
But before we dive into all that drama, let's shift gears a bit. You mentioned earlier how the Pope Joan story starts to break free from all the religious debates and find its way into secular storytelling. How does that happen?
It's a great question. And it shows you how powerful a story like this can be. Remember, we're not just talking about dry theological arguments here. We're talking hidden identities, ambition, a dramatic fall from grace.
It's got all the makings of a great drama.
Yeah, exactly. So it's no wonder that someone like Giovanni Boccaccio, a famous writer during the Italian Renaissance, picks up the story.
Is a big deal back then, right?
Huge. And he includes Pope Joan in his book about, famous women. But here's the thing, his portrayal of Joan is really interesting.
Oh, how so?
Well, unlike those religious writers we talked about earlier, he's actually pretty sympathetic to Joan. He focuses on how smart she was, her ambition. He even hints at, like, a romantic relationship she might have had.
So he's less concerned with her being a legitimate pope
Yeah.
and more interested in her as a person.
Right. It's like he's saying, hey, this is a complex human being with feelings and desires. And that shift in perspective is huge. It helps open the door for Pope Joan to become this, like, more widely admired figure, even outside those religious circles.
She's breaking free from the whole church debate and becoming a more universal story.
Exactly. And you see this even more clearly in the evolution of the Pope's tarot card.
Oh, the tarot. Now we're talking. But wait, I always knew that card as the High Priestess.
Right, right. But originally, that Pope's card, that was Pope Joan. It was a straight-up depiction of this powerful, maybe mythical female figure who snuck into the highest levels of the church.
So how did it morph into the High Priestess?
Well, over time, the meaning of the card kind of expanded. It became less about this specific historical figure and more about, like, this archetype of feminine wisdom and spiritual authority.
Wow. So the story that was once used to, like, put down the church and keep women out of power is now a symbol of female empowerment.
That's the thing with myths and legends. They can change and adapt to fit the times, and those old stories, they can have all sorts of different meanings depending on who's telling them and when.
Makes you wonder what those 13th century monks would think if they saw the Pope Joan story being used like this today.
I bet they'd be pretty shocked. But it shows you the power of a good story, right? It can capture our imaginations and get us talking about power, gender, the whole idea of truth itself.
It definitely makes you think.
And the conversation doesn't stop with the tarot. Remember how we mentioned Pope Joan popping up in those 18th century French plays?
Oh yeah, those?
Well, those plays weren't just rehashing the old story. They used Pope Joan as a way to comment on society, to make fun of the monarchy and the church.
So now they're using her to poke at secular authorities too.
Exactly. It goes to show you that those themes of ambition, deception, fighting against what society expects of you, those are timeless themes that resonate with people no matter what era you're in.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so we followed the Pope Joan story from a little rumor in a 13th century chronicle to this multifaceted cultural phenomenon. But before we wrap up, I got to ask about the elephant in the room, or should I say the chair in the room.
Ah, you mean the Sadia Stercoraria, that infamous Pope-checking chair?
The one and only,
Uh-huh.
that's got to be one of the weirdest parts of this whole story, right?
It definitely takes the cake for bizarre. But it also perfectly illustrates how a myth, once it takes hold, can spawn all these crazy beliefs.
Because, seriously, a chair designed to, well, it's pretty outlandish.
It's totally ludicrous, but that's what makes it so fascinating. It shows you how freaked out people were about the idea of a woman being pope.
They needed some kind of ritual, no matter how ridiculous, to assure themselves it could never happen again.
It seems that way. And the fact that this myth stuck around for centuries, even when people were debunking the whole Pope Joan story, shows you how deep-seated those anxieties were.
But then we also have those accounts that suggest the chair wasn't for checking anyone's gender, but was just a rather basic toilet.
Right, like a symbol of papal humility, a reminder that even the most powerful people are, well, human.
So we've got two completely different interpretations of this one object, each one reflecting different fears and beliefs.
And isn't that a perfect metaphor for the whole Pope Joan story? It's a tale that's been molded and remolded over the centuries, reflecting what each generation wants to believe.
So it's like, even if the chair wasn't really for, checking, it still highlights how uncomfortable people were with the idea of a female pope.
Absolutely. And that discomfort, it really shaped how people interpreted the whole Pope Joan story.
We've explored her supposed origins, followed the story's evolution through all these debates and interpretations, even saw how it popped up in tarot cards.
And even though we may never know for sure if she actually existed,
Right, like was she real or just a really good story?
the impact of her story is undeniable.
It sparked arguments, inspired artists, made us question what we thought we knew about power and gender.
And even today, centuries later, people are still captivated by this story.
Why do you think that is? What is it about Pope Joan that still grabs our attention?
I think on some level, it's our fascination with the underdog, right? Those who go against the grain, defy expectations, challenge the status quo.
She's like this ultimate symbol of someone breaking free from what society tells them they can and can't do.
Exactly. And whether she was real or not, Joan represents this possibility of transformation, of pushing past those societal limits and achieving something truly extraordinary.
It makes you realize that everyone has a story worth telling, even those whose voices have been silenced or ignored throughout history.
Absolutely. Those hidden stories, they're often the most fascinating ones.
So even if Pope Joan never actually sat on the papal throne,
Her story continues to challenge us, inspire us centuries later, and honestly, I think that's a legacy worth celebrating.
it really makes you think, right? A story that might be completely made up can still hold so much meaning for people across different times and cultures.
That's the magic of myths. They tap into something deeper than just historical facts. They speak to these universal themes of ambition, identity, fighting against the norms.
And the fact that the Pope Joan story has persisted for so long, it tells you those themes. They still resonate with us today. But before we wrap up this deep dive completely, I can't resist bringing up one last detail about this whole Pope Joan saga.
Oh,
We've talked about the sedia Strickeraria, the infamous chair that supposedly was used to, well, verify the Pope's masculinity.
yes, the so-called poke-checking chair.
That's the one. It's a prime example of how a myth, once it takes root, can lead to all these bizarre beliefs.
It stretches the limits of believability, that's for sure. But that's what makes it so intriguing. It really shows how deeply people were invested in maintaining their worldview, even if it meant coming up with the most outlandish explanations.
In this case, the anxiety stemmed from the possibility of a woman holding the highest office in the church.
Exactly, a fear so potent that they conjured up this elaborate ritual, a chair designed to ensure that such a scenario would never come to pass again.
It's like a physical manifestation of their fear and distrust of female authority.
It's fascinating how deeply ingrained those anxieties were, so much so that this myth about the chair persisted for centuries, even as the Pope Joan story itself faced scrutiny and debunking.
But then we also have those other accounts that suggest the chair wasn't for gender verification at all.
That's right. Some scholars, like Platina, portray it as a symbol of papal humility, not a tool of suspicion.
So we're left with two completely different interpretations of this one object, each one reflecting different anxieties and beliefs.
And that, I think, is the perfect way to understand the Pope Joan story as a whole. This tale has been shaped and reshaped over the centuries, a mirror reflecting the hopes, fears, and biases of each generation that has embraced it.
As we wrap up our exploration of this captivating myth, it strikes me that perhaps the truth about Pope Joan is less important than the questions her story continues to raise.
That's a great point, because ultimately, the Pope Joan story is about so much more than just a single, possibly fictional individual.
It's about the enduring power of narratives, the way they can challenge our assumptions, spark our imaginations, and make us grapple with complex issues of history, gender, and what it means to be human.
It's a potent reminder that the past is never truly settled, that even the most well-established narratives can be reinterpreted and revised.
And in the end, the search for truth. It's an ongoing journey. It's about being open to new perspectives, embracing ambiguity, recognizing that history isn't just a collection of facts, but a tapestry woven from stories, myths, and legends.
Stories like Pope Joan's that continue to shape our understanding of the world.
So as you move on from this deep dive, dear listener, we encourage you to keep questioning, keep exploring, keep digging for those hidden stories that lie beneath the surface of history. After all, as we've learned from Pope Joan, sometimes the most fascinating truths aren't found in official records, but in the whispers and legends that echo through time.